This is the story of one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in British history. A story of human error, systemic failure, and a culture that turned a blind eye. Until it was too late. Welcome to Error 1. I'm Eckhard Jan, and today we dive deep into the tragedy of the Herald of Free Enterprise, a ship that sank off the Belgian coast in March 1987, claiming the lives of 193 people. The sinking of the Herald of Free Enterprise is considered the worst disaster in British shipping history since the sinking of the Titanic. It was a cold March evening in 1987. The sea off the Belgian coast was calm, too calm. Passengers aboard the Herald of Free Enterprise, a British roll-on roll-off ferry, were settling in for the short trip across the English Channel to Dover. Families returning from ski holidays, truck drivers heading back to the UK, tourists clutching duty-free bags. No one knew that within just 90 seconds of leaving port, they would be fighting for their lives. By the time the icy waters receded, 193 people were dead. The youngest was just 9 years old. The Herald of Free Enterprise was a ferry and regularly crossed the English Channel between England and the European mainland, in particular between ports in France, Belgium, and Holland. She belonged to the then shipping company Townsend Thoresen from England. In the early evening hours of March 6, 1987, the ferry was due to sail from Zeebrugge, Belgium, back to Dover, England. There were 80 crew members, around 459 passengers, 81 cars, and 47 trucks on board, making it fully loaded. The ship left the harbor in the twilight shortly before sunset at 1824. The ship accelerated and suddenly began to lean. Water ingress. Just 4 minutes later, the Herald of Free Enterprise had capsized. The wreck was less than 1 kilometer from the Belgian coast. The first rescue workers quickly reached the wrecked ship. However, many of the passengers who survived the initial impact were trapped in the half-submerged hull and died of hypothermia. A total of 193 passengers, including 38 crew members, perished in the freezing water. But what had happened? What led to this terrible catastrophe? Let's take another look at the chain of error together. The English Channel, which separates the coasts of England and mainland Europe, is one of the busiest waterways in the world. It has a long history as one of the most important trade routes. The English Channel has a length of 350 miles and a width of 150 miles at its widest point and only 21 miles at its narrowest point. The channel is used daily by more than 400 container ships, freighters, tankers, and passenger ships. Ferry traffic in particular plays a crucial role in connecting England with mainland Europe. Ferries offer an efficient and flexible way of transporting people, vehicles, and freight across the channel. They operate a variety of routes departing from the ports of Dover, Calais, Folkestone, Dieppe, and other locations. These ferry services allow not only locals to visit friends and family, but also businesses to transport their goods quickly and cheaply between the two markets. Before the construction of the Eurotunnel, ferries were the only transportation link besides air travel. Townsend Thoresen was a well-known British shipping company at the time. Founded in 1968 through the merger of two companies, Townsend Brothers Ferries Ltd. and Thoresen Car Ferries Ltd., it quickly established itself as a leading provider of ferry services in the English Channel and the North Sea. Townsend Thoresen was born in 1968, but its roots go back further, into the 1920s and 1930s, when two separate companies laid the groundwork for what would become a channel giant. George Townsend established a cross-channel shipping company in the 1920s, focusing on transporting vehicles between Dover and Calais. Meanwhile, Thoresen Car Ferries, founded by Norwegian shipping interests, was running services between Southampton and Cherbourg. In the 1960s, with car ownership booming and Europe more accessible than ever, roll-on roll-off ferries, allowing drivers to bring their vehicles aboard, were in high demand. In 1968, these two operations merged to create Townsend Thoresen, a powerful new brand in the fast-growing cross-channel ferry market. It began with a promise: speed, efficiency and modernity on the English Channel. For decades, Townsend Thoresen ferries were a familiar sight: bright orange and white ships with bold black lettering, crossing back and forth between Britain and mainland Europe. They served holiday makers and truck drivers alike, proudly delivering passengers to France, Belgium, and back. The company quickly expanded its fleet and routes, becoming a household name in the UK. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Townsend Thoresen thrived. Its fleet of modern ferries, painted in a now iconic orange livery, operated from Dover, Portsmouth, and Felixstowe, connecting Britain to France, Belgium, and Spain. Their business model emphasized speed and turnaround efficiency. Ferries would dock, offload, reload, and be back out to sea in under an hour. This aggressive schedule was part of what made the company so competitive, but also, eventually, so dangerous. The market for ferry services in the English Channel was highly competitive. Several shipping companies, including SeaLink, tried to take market share from each other. At the beginning of the 1980s, various shipyards developed a new type of ferry that could be used even more efficiently and cost-effectively: ro-ro ferries. The name ro-ro refers to the ability of vehicles to independently drive onto the ship, roll on, and also drive off again, roll off, without having to be loaded at great expense. A special feature of ro-ro ferries is their large loading capacity and flexibility. They are capable of transporting a variety of different vehicles, including cars, trucks, motorhomes, and even trains. These vehicles can drive on board the ferry via wide ramps and are then stowed safely on the ship. Another advantage of ro-ro ferries is their speed and efficiency. Compared to conventional cargo ships, they can load and unload cargo much faster, resulting in shorter turnaround times and lower operating costs. This makes them particularly attractive for the transportation of perishable goods and other time-critical cargo. The MS Herald of Free Enterprise by Townsend Thoresen was such a ro-ro ferry. She was one of 3 ships built in 1980 by the Schickern Unterfässer shipyard in Bremerhaven. They were specially designed for use on the English Channel. It was a workhorse of the busy Dover-Calais route, able to carry over 1,400 passengers and over 100 vehicles. This new class of ship had it all in the truest sense of the word, as the ferry could carry vehicles on 2 decks instead of the usual one. The special design was to completely revolutionize cross-channel journeys. Townsend Thoresen wanted to set itself apart from the competition. Thanks to their impressive speed, they were able to make up to 5 trips a day to Calais. Their flagship vessels, including the Herald of Free Enterprise, Pride of Free Enterprise, and Spirit of Free Enterprise, were designed to maximize vehicle capacity and minimize port time. But beneath the efficiency, cracks in the safety culture were starting to show. By the mid-1980s, Townsend Thoresen was transporting over 1 million passengers and hundreds of thousands of vehicles each year. But internally, a different picture was emerging. Crew members complained of fatigue, understaffing, and a lack of proper safety protocols. Turnaround times were so tight that safety checks often became assumptions, not actions. The company had no fail-safe to confirm whether boat doors were closed before departure, no warning lights, no bridge indicators, no cameras, just human trust in a chain of command under pressure. The pressure to meet schedules and beat competitors like SeaLink and Brittany Ferries meant that corners were often cut. But management rarely intervened. As long as ships were moving and profits held steady, the system was working. Until it didn't. March 6, 1987 was a cold winter's day. The Herald of Free Enterprise arrived in Zeebrugge from Dover in the late afternoon. Her schedule was tight. The crew only had an hour and a half to unload, clean and load the ship. The second boatswain was responsible for unloading the car deck that Friday afternoon. When the last vehicles had left the ferry, he went into his cabin for a break. He was not needed on the car deck again until 6 p.m. From 5 p.m., the first cars and trucks rolled through the huge bow doors onto the car deck. Because the shipping company had sold discounted tickets, the crowd was huge. They only had an hour until departure. And the shipping company insisted that the trips had to be made on time. After the lower car deck was loaded, we continued with the upper deck. However, the rarely used port of Zeebrugge was not ideally suited to the design of the Herald of Free Enterprise. Unlike Dover or Calais, Zeebrugge had a shallow loading ramp, requiring the ferry to take on water ballast at the bow to lower itself enough for vehicles to embark. Even more time delayed, the hectic pace increased. That ballast was supposed to be pumped out before sailing. That night, it wasn't. The ship was heavy in the bow, sitting dangerously low, but that wasn't the only problem. The biggest problem was this: the bow doors were still open. At 6:05 p.m., 5 minutes late, the ferry set off with 539 passengers and 80 crew members and headed for the harbor exit. As it picked up speed outside the harbor walls, seawater began to pour in through the gaping bow doors. Tons of water surged onto the car deck. As soon as they had left the harbor behind them, the crew accelerated the ship to the maximum permitted speed of 18 knots. What nobody had noticed at the time was that the front hatch was wide open. Suddenly, there was a jolt. Within a few seconds, huge masses of water entered the lower car deck. At 6:28 p.m., the ship tilted 30 degrees to port, to the left side. Vehicles and trucks immediately slid to one side, and the ship continued to tilt. Water poured through the side windows. In just 90 seconds, the ship flooded with cold North Sea water. Miraculously, it did not sink completely. Underneath the ship, at a depth of around 30 feet, was a sandbank on which it came to rest at a 90-degree angle. Another ship nearby saw the ferry's lights flicker on and then go out. The crew alerted the harbor master of Zeebrugge. A large-scale rescue operation began immediately. Meanwhile, over 500 people were fighting for survival inside the ferry. The water temperature was only 3 degrees Celsius or 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The people only had a few minutes before they were in danger of dying of hypothermia in the cold water. Truck driver Brian Rees was in the cafeteria with his wife and 2 children when it happened.
There was a roar,
He recalled.
The ship tilted and people started sliding across the floor, chairs crashing around. Then everything went black.
Marion Coomber, a holidaymaker, was trapped in a compartment filling with freezing seawater. She survived by breathing through an air pocket for over 3 hours, listening to people around her scream and then fall silent. Others weren't so lucky. An eyewitness later reported,
You could hear people shouting and screaming, but that became less and less as time went on.
Many people were able to escape through side windows.
We tried to climb onto the tables and keep our heads above water.
Another passenger spoke of a nightmare.
There was water everywhere. Everyone was looking for an exit.
35 minutes after the capsizing, Coast Guard helicopters picked up the first survivors. Divers from the region who volunteered to help swam through the dark interior of the ferry and rescued those who were still moving. On land, ambulances transported the injured to nearby hospitals, but for many, it was already too late. 193 did not survive the ferry accident. Entire families were lost. But how could this catastrophe have happened? When investigators examined the stricken ship the next morning, they saw that the ferry's 16-feet-high bow doors were open, and they quickly discovered that they had not been damaged by a collision. Questioning the surviving crew members revealed that the second boatswain was responsible for closing the bow doors that evening. However, he had gone to sleep during his break and missed the announcement, "All hands on station." Nor had anyone noticed that he was missing from his position. But here's the critical detail. There was no system in place to check whether the doors were closed before sailing. The first officer assumed the job had been done. The captain, David Lowry, couldn't even see the doors from the bridge. And in the end, the vessel was pushed out of port by a company that prized speed over safety. To make matters worse, the ship was overloaded, not just proverbially, but literally. The investigators found that the Herald of Free Enterprise was at least 13% overloaded, which corresponded to several hundred tons of weight. There was another weight problem with the ballast tanks. They had to be filled so that the upper car deck could be loaded. The water in the tanks then had to be pumped out again before the ferry set sail. However, the time pressure meant that the pumping out was delayed and not completed until later. The ship was not allowed to set sail until the tanks had been emptied. It accelerated to full speed immediately after leaving the harbor basin. Although there was a regulation that ro-ro ferries were only allowed to cast off when the bow hatches were closed, there were no instructions on how the crews were to implement this. The captains of the shipping company had been pointing this out for years and had requested signal lamps for the hatches on the bridge. 3/4 of a year earlier, a captain wrote to his superiors,
"There is no indication on the bridge as to whether the most important watertight doors are closed or not. These are the bow or stern doors. Due to the very short distance between the berth and the open sea on both sides of the channel, this can be a problem if there is a delay or there are problems closing the gates. Indicator lights on the bridge could allow the crew to monitor the situation."
How right he was. However, his proposal was always rejected by his superiors. In an internal email, the superiors made fun of this.
"Do they need a report to tell them whether the deck watchman is awake and sober? My goodness."
Another replied,
"Nice try. We pay someone to keep an eye on things."
Several crew members unanimously reported that the closing of the bow doors was often left to chance. The chief officer should also have checked the gates again, but because the ferry was late and he was needed on the bridge, he did not do so, according to the investigation report. The shipping company was determined to be on time. That was the top priority. 6 months before the accident, a responsible manager at Townsend Thoresen wrote,
"To be clear, a late departure from Zeebrugge is not an option for us. We always want to leave 15 minutes ahead of schedule."
So how did it all end? Captain Lowry never worked at sea again. He was cleared of negligence, but his career ended that day. Mark Stanley, the assistant boatswain, was devastated. He had been overworked, sleep-deprived, and received no wake-up call before departure. He never fully recovered. The Commission of Inquiry saw further, much more serious mistakes on the part of the superiors, which had made the chain of errors possible in the first place. The Commission found that almost all of the problems that led to the sinking of the Herald of Free Enterprise were already known to the superiors. The captains had repeatedly complained that the ships were very often overloaded and that there were more passengers on board than was permitted. They demanded displays on the bridge so that the crew could see whether the bow and stern hatches were open or closed. They also called for better ballast pumps to prevent the problem of pumping out in Zeebrugge. None of these suggestions and recommendations were ever implemented by Townsend Thoresen. The Commission came to the conclusion that important and serious errors lay at the top of the organization. Inadequate precautions by the operator, the shipping company Townsend Thoresen, were the cause of the disaster. Error 1. The public inquiry was scathing. It was clear this wasn't just one man falling asleep. It was a culture that allowed dangerous shortcuts to become routine. Unlike in the case of an organizational fault, the English judiciary saw all those involved in the management, from the board members to the junior superintendents, as legally responsible and held them personally liable. One prosecutor used a word rarely seen in official British documents.
From top to bottom, the company was infected with the disease of sloppiness.
Criminal charges were brought against the company and 7 individuals, including the managing directors. They were subsequently sued for corporate manslaughter, corporate liability, for negligent and grossly negligent homicide. The British Department for Transport imposed a fine of £400,000. Due to this incident and other economic challenges, the shipping company subsequently ran into difficulties. In the years that followed, various restructuring measures were implemented, and eventually the Townsend Thoresen's brand was discontinued. The ferries and services continued were rebranded under the name P&O European Ferries. But the stain remained. The company was later absorbed by other operators. For the survivors, the trauma lingered for decades. Paul Smith, a crew member who helped dozens escape through broken windows, developed PTSD. "The nightmares never really stop," he said in a 1997 interview. Many who lost loved ones formed support groups demanding ferry safety reforms. And slowly, change came. After the disaster, international maritime laws were updated. Ferries like the Herald of Free Enterprise, with open car decks and no watertight compartments, were re-evaluated. New safety rules were introduced. Indicators on the bridge to show bow door status. CCTV systems for the car deck. Mandatory safety management systems for all ships. The Herald of Free Enterprise became a textbook case of how human error, poor communication, and corporate pressure can kill. At the core of this tragedy was something chilling in its simplicity. No one checked. No one made sure that the bow doors, the most basic safety feature, were closed before the ship sailed. In aviation, in medicine, in shipping, and in our daily lives, it's easy to assume someone else has done the job, but assuming can be fatal. In May 1994, 7 years after the Herald of Free Enterprise disaster, the Eurotunnel was put into operation. Since then, it has provided a direct rail link between France and England, making the journey not only faster but also safer. This was the Herald of Free Enterprise. Thank you for listening to Era 1. If you found this episode powerful or thought-provoking, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with someone who values stories about how mistakes can shape the world. And don't forget to subscribe to my podcast so you never miss an episode. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and see you next time. And always double-check the doors.